name's Kyle. I'm going to be talking about physician-assisted death. Just a little background, it's a process in which a terminally ill patient with less than 6 months to live and is mentally competent can be prescribed drugs to ultimately end their life. This has been legal in Switzerland for decades now, and it was legalized in Oregon in 1997, and I believe it's Oregon, Washington, Vermont, and New Mexico that it's legal. My main claim is that physician-assisted death is a beneficial option for patients with terminal or degenerative illnesses. This is mainly for three reasons. First of all, it ends the suffering of these patients. Second, it frees the patient's families and loved ones from emotional burden. And third, each person with a terminal or degenerative illness has the right to choose their own medical treatment or lack thereof. So I'll be going through the points one by one. I'll try to make it quick. First point is that physician-assisted death ends the suffering of terminally ill or degenerative illness patients. You may have heard of Brittany Maynard in 2014. She was a California resident, newlywed. She was 29 years old, and she was diagnosed with a stage 4 glioblastoma, which is a malignant brain tumor. And after hearing about the treatment options, she decided to uproot her life in California, establish residency in Oregon, and participate in their Death with Dignity Act, which I'll go over later. In an interview with CNN, she was quoted as saying, "I don't want to die, but I am dying, and I want to die on my own terms. There's no treatment that would save my life, and the recommended treatments would destroy the time I had left." This kind of just displays that even with the necessary treatment, she would suffer until she ultimately died. Similarly, Craig Ewert was a 59-year-old professor in the United Kingdom with Lou Gehrig's disease. And he, after hearing about his treatment options, traveled to Switzerland where you don't have to be a resident. And for this reason, he was the subject of a documentary called The Suicide Tourist. It's apparently a growing trend where people will travel to Switzerland in order to end their lives. In this documentary, he was quoted as saying, "I'm not tired of living, I'm tired of the disease. I'd like to continue, but the thing is, I really can't. I've got death, or I've got suffering in death." It makes a whole lot of sense to me. I know those are just two highly publicized cases, but the Death with Dignity Act in Oregon, they produce a report every year about the statistics of the people who have taken their lives. In their 2014 report, 859 people since the start in 1997 have taken their lives. Of these, 88% of them showed concern in the form of less able to engage in activities making life enjoyable, and 80% of them said that they were afraid of losing dignity in their end-of-life care. This ultimately just shows that the suffering that they're ensuing would be until the very end. The second point I mentioned was that physician-assisted death frees the patient's families and loved ones from emotional burden. Again, consider Brittany Maynard of Oregon. She said, "I would have suffered in hospice care for weeks or even months, and I don't want that nightmare scenario for my family." Craig Ewert was quoted as saying, "If I don't go through with it, my choice is essentially to suffer and to inflict suffering on my family and then die." From the same Oregon Death with Dignity Act report in 2014, 40% of people who ultimately ended their lives expressed concern in the form of the burden on the family and loved ones that they would have with afterlife or end-of-life care. I also do have personal experience with this. That's why I chose this topic. In 2013, I acted as primary caretaker for my grandfather who had dementia. And I'll try to slim down the story because of time, but ultimately I was there for the last 6 months of his life, and before he was gone completely, he said, "I want to die before I lose myself." And that was hard to hear, but I mean, our family kind of stuck it out. And towards the last months of his life, he got pretty bad, and I had to introduce myself to him as caretaker rather than his grandson because he'd get frustrated and angry, and he devoted 40 years of his life to church, and the things that he said, and he swung at me one time, so that was hard to do. That was hard to go through. I'm sure some of you have had experienced this as well, sadly, but I can tell you that degenerative illnesses and terminal illnesses do have a significant emotional effect on the family. The last point that I'm going through is that each person with a terminal illness has the right to choose their treatment or lack thereof. This comes to the basic idea of autonomy, or someone choosing their own medical treatment. First of all, the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, of the 859 people who ultimately ended their life, 90% of them were previously enrolled in a hospice program. The main opponent of the argument is that anyone with a terminal illness or degenerative illness should go through hospice or palliative care, which is end-of-life care, making them comfortable. But 90% of them already were in hospice care, so yeah. Also, there was an interview on National Public Radio about the topic, and Andrew Solomon, who's a professor of clinical psychology at Columbia, said, "Let us not institutionalize and enshrine in law prohibitions that force us to suffer contrary to our beliefs and force us to watch those we suffer contrary to their wishes." He also said, "While no one should be pressed into assisted dying, no one should be categorically denied that right." It's about dignity. And last but not least, the Oregon Death with Dignity Act. As I said, 859 patients took their life, but ultimately 1,327 people filled out the prescriptions and had the drugs in hand. So that's only 65% of people that had the drugs, so it does show that most patients just want the opportunity to choose and have the decision in their hands. I'll just wrap it up. My proposition is that physician-assisted death is a beneficial option for patients with terminal or degenerative illnesses because it ends their suffering, it frees the patient's families and loved ones from emotional burden, and each person with this illness has the right to choose their treatment. Thank you.
Okay, the proposition's clearly identified. I thought that you laid out the secondary points pretty well. The third point is falling into the area of a value claim, and once you've got the Solomon testimony, I think that that's definitely where it fits. The question that with the statistic that you have at the end seems to suggest that that is in fact the case. If 65% don't use the medication even though they've sought the medication, then apparently their suffering is not the same thing that you are describing in other situations. Most of them don't see it as being suffering, so their pursuit of that may be a result of something else, and there needs to be a little bit development of that. The data about the people being in hospice before they pursued this, I thought that that was okay, but then that doesn't tell me that there's anything inadequate about hospice, especially since a large number of them didn't follow through with the medications that they received. So that, I think, is a little problematic. I thought you did a good job identifying some of the concerns that people had about their end-of-life situations. You are equating, though, some of those things with suffering. And so the suffering issue, I guess there's a little bit of a definitional issue that has to come up here. Are we talking about physical suffering? Are we talking about mental suffering, a lack of alternatives and choices? And then, like I said, you're dancing on the edge of a value claim there. The impact, nobody's going to deny that the death of a loved one is going to have an impact on the family members, but the nature of that death and the kind of impact that it has, that's very speculative in this situation, and everybody's relationship is going to be a little bit different there. Obviously, you describe a situation that's personally problematic for you, and I can see how tough that is. I understand the situation that you're talking about there. However, could that have been answered by a hospice care instead of your being the caregiver in that situation? I don't know. I don't know what the circumstances are, and if it turns out that it's a money issue, then the argument is really that it's a convenience in terms of money rather than it's a necessity in order to relieve pain and suffering. I thought that you did a good job previewing at the beginning of the speech, but the signposts in the body of the speech were a little bit less consistent than they should have been, and that you spoke pretty effectively to the audience. Thank you very much, folks.